Hello and welcome to Face to Face. Our guest today again is local engineer Werner Simbeck. And once again, we're going to be talking about what I think is probably, it's superseded everything else really in some way. It's become the most important issue, the most dangerous issue that we face, and that is the nuclear meltdowns in Fukushima, Japan, that happened last March when they had the big earthquake followed by the tsunami. Nothing's been in the media. In fact, you're probably listening to this and saying, what? What are you talking about? But folks, it is a disaster of immense proportions. It has not gone away. It's getting worse. The media will not talk about it. The politicians will not talk about it. But we want to talk about it and not only outline the mess that we're in, because this is probably the single greatest human-caused catastrophe that happened in one time and one place since we've come onto this planet. But also we want to talk about the road that we have to follow to get away from all of this, because the corporations are leading us into total, absolute disaster, and if we continue to follow along their road, we are really finished. So we're going to talk about that as well. So Werner, Fukushima, what do you want to say?
Well, it's been 9 months, I suppose, since March 11 from last year when that accident happened. What strikes me is that there's so little talk, little discussion about the issue. It doesn't get mentioned by any of the politicians. There's a few exceptions. The Green Party leader, Elizabeth May, she did actually mention it recently about that issue. She had a sort of an event with David Suzuki not so long ago here in Saanich, so that was interesting. So during that discussion period after they showed that film with David Suzuki, there was some question and answer period, and the issue of Fukushima came up, and she was aware of the issues and was concerned about it. So that was, one of the only people that I've heard recently of some importance who mentioned it. But then again, you don't hear any of that on either radio or on TV if you were to watch it. I tend to watch CBC News regularly because I like to see what they say. What are they mentioning on the issues? And they don't mention anything. Climate change hasn't been on the radar screen for quite a while. Occasionally we had a little bit issues about the pipeline we're building, but again, it's just really superficial as far as I'm concerned. The issues don't really get discussed as they should. But coming back to Fukushima, so we do have heard though that some the debris field is moving closer to the coast. So in Tofino, people have found various items that have obviously come from Japan, items that were washed into the sea, into the ocean. So, and it's moving much faster over here than they had anticipated. They were expecting it to take up to 2 years before the first bit of debris is coming our way, but I was just reading an article where they're saying the area, if you were to spread out this floating debris field, is as big as 2 times Texas. So it's humongous, it's huge. So, it is a concern, not the debris itself, but the radiation that comes with it, basically.
Okay, now I want to interrupt here, and I just want to read something that it was the last sentence in the second last sentence in an article that may have appeared in the Montreal Gazette, one of the very, very few articles in the last many months that have talked about this nuclear disaster at all. And it says, there is no safe level of radiation. And what is coming out of Fukushima is massive, massive amounts of radiation. Mm-hmm. I think much more than would be coming from 1, 2, 5, or 10 or 20 nuclear bombs going off. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would totally agree with that.
And what's happening is it is radioactive particles that are floating around or in the water, in the ocean, coming this way, coating the world, really. And if you ingest them, mm-hmm. then they are in you and they are giving off, the worst.
What I'd like to sort of explain a little bit is that, radiation is sort of an obscure subject matter. We all sort of know a little bit about it, but nobody really explains how it works, and how that could maybe affect one's personal health. The DNA, I think everyone has heard of the DNA. DNA is just a molecule. And if you paid attention a little bit in chemistry, different molecules make different substances. You have the periodic table, there are all these different elements, and then combination of different elements make different things. The easiest is water. H2O, everybody understands that. 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atoms are joined together to make this beautiful substance called water, right? So when we're talking about radiation, we're talking things that happen at the molecular level. Okay, and a DNA molecule, if it gets damaged on the molecular scale. And this radiation business that we're talking about here from Fukushima as an example happens on the molecular level, meaning there are elements, there are components of matter basically that are now radioactive due to the processes going on in a nuclear power plant. And when you have substances that the body needs, so say cesium, because I believe a potassium analog, it goes pretty much everywhere in your body. The body needs potassium, and cesium happens to be a radioactive element, has a half-life of 30 years. It goes everywhere in your body, and now suddenly can irradiate your body on a molecular level and potentially damage the DNA molecule, which then will cause cancer over time.
And many other problems. It's not only cancer.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But so cancer is what everyone is mostly familiar with. Everybody, I think, understands that radiation and cancer go together. Exactly how, nobody really ever gets explained. But this is the issue. So as the background radiation goes up, the incidence of cancer also goes up. Your chances of dying of cancer are now the greatest cause of death in Canada. Right? Out of 2 people, 1 person will die of cancer. I think it's as big as that. If it was 3, maybe out of 3 people, 1 person will die of cancer. I think it's as close as out of 2 people, 1 person will die of cancer. So that's the true epidemic. And the issue is people are not being told how radiation really works. They weren't explained in school. It's a difficult topic. Politicians don't want to go there. They probably weren't very good in high school science to begin with. And because the subject matter is obscure, nobody is being told exactly how it works. Because once people were to understand how it works, they would worry, and they should. And that's, there are things we can do to help protect ourselves, but that would mean we would have to measure and be out front about how toxic, or in this case, how radioactive is the food, lower the thresholds, try to limit the amount of radiation that you're exposed to in such to lower the rates of cancer caused by it. I think that's what's important.
Now, we're talking about this article. It's January 14th, 2012. So when this is filmed, it was a couple of weeks ago. The picture on the story shows. This is what it says under the picture: a radiation detector is used in Manhattan's Sushi Yasuda restaurant in April. The restaurant is checking for radiation in the fish that they are selling people. That's the level of concern that we should all be having. I'll just quickly show that picture. I'm sure it won't come through very clear, but so it has this particulate, this radioactive particulate is spread around the world many times. Of course, the West Coast was hit hard shortly after Fukushima. Fukushima, although they never mention it, basically, it was a nuclear meltdown, which means the nuclear fuel became so hot that it melted right through the entire containment vessel into the earth. They can't find it. They can't deal with it. They can't. I mean, even in Japan, the most technological country in the world, probably, it's beyond their control. It's in the groundwater. It's going into the ocean. Huge amounts of water, heavily radioactive water, are being dumped into the ocean because the Japanese are using water to try and keep things cool. It becomes extremely radioactive. They have nowhere to store it, so it's just being dumped into the ocean. Yeah,
so they have a lot of leaks that allows it to go into the ocean. Of course, it also evaporates. So you have a lot of steam coming off it. And of course, again, that takes with it radioactive material into the air, and that gets spread around by the winds.
Now, we were promised that nuclear power was completely safe. That's how they told us it was going to be, and that's why they built it. And it's built all around the world, including in Canada. Now there's been a disaster really of unimaginable proportions. And what they do, although I won't even try to guess the number of people who are going to be made sick or die from this, but if I said in the many millions or more,
Right. Well, independent experts that I've read, they estimate that Japan will see an additional 1 million people dying from cancer-related causes due to Fukushima in the next 10 to 15 years. So it's extremely high. I mean, we're not talking small numbers. But again, this is what we find ourselves in a world that is where people's lives isn't all that important. It's all about protecting the economy. The global recovery is so much more important.
And not only the economy, because we're part of the economy, it's protecting the corporations who own the economy. Sure. They are the ones who are being protected here.
Yeah. But I think that is always like, we had our Prime Minister just speak in Switzerland to the wealthiest and richest countries and individuals in the world. And it looked like as if, he was addressing his or her bosses. Is that who controls everything? Obviously, it does. I mean, it is. I mean, the things that came out of that speech, if he was to address Parliament that way, we would probably accept that. But the fact is that he was somewhere abroad, addressing this rather important issues that he was discussing here to a foreign entity. We didn't elect any of these people that he was speaking to.
You mean he was giving them the first view of his plan?
Yeah, absolutely. So why does he, release this information to them rather than to us first? I don't understand. I mean, it does sort of make sense if you realize who controls the world per se, right? We're talking money controls the world, and whoever owns the most amount of money has the most amount of control, and those are your true masters.
It's the golden rule.
Absolutely.
Those who have the gold make the rules.
Right. So coming back to Fukushima, so the thing is, people may wonder what can they do about it. I mean, the fact is that we're not monitoring, and that's what the article in the Gazette clearly showed, is that Canada is not monitoring the food as it comes from Japan. They basically rely on what Japan is doing. Japan is monitoring their food. They have a limit, for example, on fish. It can't be more than 100 becquerels per kilogram. And conveniently, Canada has a limit of 1,000 becquerels per kilogram. See, Japan had already elevated their limit of what is acceptable to them. I'm not sure what the previous level was.
It was lower than 100.
It was lower than 100. I think it was somewhere around 10. So they increased it about a tenfold. But Canadian limit is an additional tenfold after that. So basically, all the fish that they can't consume themselves, they sell us, because we have such a high, threshold that we can accept. There's no danger to anybody, it seems, which is obviously crazy.
Now, Werner mentioned this to me earlier. My jaw just dropped when I suddenly realized what was being done, because our standards are so pathetically low. We'll accept anything. So, of course, we're being sold the radioactive fish and everything else that's coming out of Japan. Think of that, folks. Think that our government is doing that to us. The media doesn't even talk about it. We're completely in the dark. I just realized this.
Right. Well, the thing is, maybe the politicians themselves and the regulators may not actually realize what they're doing, right? Not everybody tends to become sort of an expert in this area, right? You may have a job to do, and you're told this is what the limit is, or this is what was decided at some point in the past. But the science may have changed recently, and it definitely has. If you listen to independent experts and you see all the studies that were done, like there was just a study released in France, for example, where they were looking at childhood leukemia rates in the country, and if you were to plot them on a map, there were clusters around each nuclear power plant that they have, and France has a lot of nuclear power plants. So the closer you live to a nuclear power plant, the higher your chances were of getting childhood leukemia for children. This is the example, it's not for younger people. So obviously there's a relationship between you and a nuclear power plant. And of course they say, oh, nuclear power is safe. Oh, there's no leakage whatsoever. Well, that's totally false, right? There are always leaks continuously. Like, for example, they have tritium releases. Tritium is radioactive hydrogen. And radioactive hydrogen, if everyone knows H2O, right? It's you have two hydrogen atoms and a single oxygen atom. That makes water. Well, imagine now you have radioactive water. Basically, that's what that is. But that goes everywhere in our body. Our body needs water. Hydrogen and oxygen form together to form water. That goes in every cell in our body. You'll have that. So if you have releases of tritium, and in Toronto, in the Toronto area and in Ontario, we have various nuclear power plants there too, and they occasionally have leaks into the river, into the lake, into the Great Lakes, and they say, oh, it was a minor tritium leak. They do say that. What they don't tell you is that, this is, if you absorb this in your body, that your chances of getting cancer goes up. Right? That doesn't get discussed at all.
And they fake, it's been proven in Japan over the years that there were many accidents that were just covered up, hidden. The public was never told. It's ongoing. That's the way the corporations operate.
There was a really interesting interview that I just watched the other day with Dr. Helen Caldicott. She has a website called ifyoulovethisplanet.org. And she was interviewing a Japanese politician. And this Japanese politician was explaining to Dr. Helen Caldicott how the regulators interact with the corporation, in this case TEPCO, the nuclear power plant operators.
In Japan.
And this is not different probably than in the United States than in most developed countries. But the way it works, you have these government employees basically that work for the regulator who are supposed to regulate the industry. When they come to retirement, they then get hired on by TEPCO, for example, as senior management people. So you have former regulators now suddenly work for the industry to represent them in order to water down, to eliminate various costs due to safety measures they may have to follow, and do testing of their equipment that may get delayed, or tests may get altered, or the goalposts basically get moved around so that it's most profitable for the corporation. And people in Japan are very loyal to the employer. So meaning if you work for a corporation, you're loyal to the corporation. And that's really important, you honor with the corporation. And then, of course, people's lives that you may be gambling with is secondary. That's not important.
And it's exactly the same here in Canada. And even when the regulators are working for the government is controlled by the corporations. So, before they retire and go to work for the corporation directly, they're still working. They're not working for us. The regulators, the governments, the ministries are no longer working for us. I think 30 years ago, it was more so that things were a little better. But now we've reached a low that is very, very low. And those are the things we've got to change. We cannot continue going as we are going, because these people will destroy everything. And I'm talking about the kinds of people who have brought us nuclear power. So what can we do? First of all, Fukushima is still happening, right? It's leaking into the ocean, the radiation, the radioactive water. It's there's steam, it's evaporating, it's uncontrolled. Now you mentioned that in the United States there were...
Yeah. Okay, so in the United States there's just over 100 nuclear power plants. And they built the last one sometime in the mid-70s. So they're all at least 4 years old. And of course, as they get to the end of their lifespan, the corporations that run them nowadays, because they were publicly funded, run by a corporation, they then want an extension for their license to extend the life of their nuclear power plant to sell more nuclear power, which is more profitable for them. But the liability is on the backs of the taxpayer, because no one will insure a nuclear power plant with the exception of a government. So basically we have 100 type Fukushima-style reactors, or at least 30 of them of the exact same makeup, the GE Mark I nuclear reactor that melted down in Fukushima.
That's General Electric.
The General Electric. There were 34, I think, in the United States that are exactly the same as were melting down in Fukushima, Japan. And the 70 or so other reactors are slightly improvements of that old Mark I reactor, but basically they're exactly the same design and they're exactly the same flaw. And the flaw is as soon as you have a power failure, as we saw, due to the earthquake. And in fact, there's a story that's being told, and there was just recently a documentary on TV, on CBC, the news channel, I suppose, where they show documentaries, where they were basically claiming that the reason why the Fukushima nuclear power reactor melted down is because it lost power, but because of the tsunami. But in fact, now data has shown that actually the meltdown occurred already prior to the tsunami hitting. They already had problems prior to this. Basically, the radiation leaks occurred already as the earthquake finished. They already had problems right at that get-go. They already lost power and they already had problems at that point. So the issue is, so we have 100 nuclear power plants of the same design with some modifications, just south of us, that are 40 years old and older. Some are close to 60 years old. They have stored all the nuclear waste right on site. And if you have any accident in the United States, we'll have another Fukushima just south of us. And there's 100 to choose from. And just recently, with all the floods that we had, there were some really record snowfalls in the Rockies, and there was a massive amount of flooding going on in the central United States. And there were 2 nuclear power plants that had to be shut down because they were flooded. They had to build dikes around the nuclear power plants to keep the water from the rivers that flowed by them at bay. I mean, so really close calls, So, we're not talking about something that's fictional. This is really real. It just doesn't get discussed. That topic does not get discussed.
And that, I think, is because there is such big corporate money in nuclear power that they want us to keep using it because they don't intend to lose that money. So nuclear power will continue. Now, it's our job to shut these plants down. But, of course, the nuclear waste has to be stored now for, in some cases, tens and tens of thousands of years because it remains dangerous and deadly for that long.
For the listeners, there's a really interesting documentary that you have to try to get a hold of and watch. It's called Into Eternity. It's based on in Finland, they have 1 nuclear power plant, and they're about to have a second. But the government has legislated to build a long-term storage facility for their own nuclear waste. And they have legislated that the waste has to last or has to be hidden from humanity, so out of harm's way, for 100,000 years. That was their goal. That's what they're working on. And it'll take about 100 years to build this long-term storage facility. And this film, Into Eternity, is really, really interesting because it really looks at all the issues surrounding this. The engineers think technically this is solvable, this problem, that we could build something, us men, who, just came from Africa not that long ago, like 100,000 years ago. We just came across from that land bridge in northern Africa into Central Europe.
And we built the safe nuclear power plants.
Yes, so, 100,000 years later, we built these nuclear power plants, and now we're building these long-term storage facilities that are supposed to, again, last at least 100,000 years. Quite the arrogance, I think, that we think we can control a Mother Nature like this. But it's just really interesting. So the engineers think we can solve this technically. However, what they don't think they have a good handle on is how do you keep humanity interest and intrigue out of it? Meaning, we've opened up every burial site in the world that we found. Every pyramid in Egypt, every tomb was opened. So if we have now these entombed nuclear waste sites in Finland, as an example, and we'll have to have these all over the world, how do we keep future generations from not digging these things up? How do we tell them, 100,000 years from now, we may not be looking the way we are, we may not be speaking English, obviously, right? It's going to change, it's going to evolve. So what kind of signs are we going to put up to let future generations know that this is a dangerous place to dig? Don't dig here. Don't bring this stuff up to the surface. And I think that is the biggest challenge. How do you keep... So what they're thinking of doing is hiding it.
And that's what we're up against. That is what these people have brought to us. Massively dangerous material that has to be stored into eternity. So, I mean, to me, it seems like the first thing we have to do is immediately stop any construction of any new nuclear power plant ever.
Right.
And we've got to somehow close down the ones that are running and begin to deal with it. This is the problem of an age.
The cost associated with this, like imagine you had to rent a space for 100,000 years. What's the cost of that? Who's going to maintain that space? Who's going to paint it? Who's going to make sure it's not leaking? What's the cost of that? I mean, the sums of money that we're talking about here in order to keep this material, the waste of nuclear power plants, locked away safely for such a long time is enormous. I think it will take all the money in the world to do this right. Meaning
there's huge amounts of it. There's huge amounts of this nuclear waste.
Oh, absolutely.
But we're almost out of time. But just to finish off, they have found a way to get rid of this nuclear waste. And what they are doing is turning it into weapons, depleted uranium weapons, and blowing them up around the world. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the former Yugoslavia, they are building weapons out of this nuclear waste and just blowing them up. When the war in Iraq started, about a day later, there were elevated levels of radioactivity over England. A day after the bombing started in Iraq that Bush did. this is what these people are doing to us.
Right. I mean, it's a really clever way of getting rid of your waste, isn't it? You know, one man's waste is another man's treasure. So in this case, the American military just picks up this new weapon. And the reason why a uranium-type weapon is great for them is because it's so, uranium is twice as dense as lead, and it has much more punch. And it also, when it flies really fast and it hits an object, it gets so hot that it self-ignites. So you don't even need an ignition material.
A few days ago, Stephen Harper, Prime Minister Harper, was doing an interview with Peter Mansbridge on CBC, and he started talking about Iran.
Yeah. He was talking about Iran, and he was basically, he thought, it seemed like Harper was very worried about Iran, scared of Iran. And in so many words that if they were to acquire a nuclear weapon, that they were going to use it. I mean, that's quite a bold statement for a prime minister to say that, basically saying that another country is going to commit the ultimate sin, so to speak, in using a nuclear weapon and destroying, obviously, Israel, because Israel always seems to be the victim in all this between Iran and the rest of the world. So Iran is going to trying to acquire a nuclear weapon and then use it. I mean, that's such an amazing statement. What I find so strange about it is that the real nuclear threat that we are under right now would be the fallout from Fukushima. That's the one we should be worried about. That's the one we should be talking about. But no, we talk about Iran. And Iran wants to build a nuclear power plant. You know, and you figure, well, God, if you look in Europe, how many European countries have a nuclear power plant? Well, lots have nuclear power plants. You know, and since Fukushima, nuclear power is not very sexy anymore. You know, nobody really wants to build them anymore, it seems, particularly in Europe. Germany being the country in the forefront due to a lot of public pressure trying to stop this madness and shut them down. And
now that's worth maybe going into a little bit. I think I've read that Germany is going to now phase out nuclear power.
Completely, yeah.
And Japan is going to do the same.
I haven't heard that particularly, but there are rumors in the sense that, see, there is a lot of public pressure. It's building in Japan, though, you know, the Japanese population is being lied to just as much as we're being lied to all the time. So a small group or small portion of Japanese citizens doesn't trust the government. In fact, majority doesn't trust them. But there is now, because of Fukushima, because people who live in Fukushima, they are being exposed to this business of radiation all the time. And Japan has the history of the 2 nuclear bombs that were ever exploded over a civilian population. They bring that as baggage or as experience. And a lot of people that were survivors of those 2 nuclear attacks are opposed to nuclear power for the obvious reasons. And I suppose now with this accident in Fukushima, that voice, the opposition to nuclear power, is getting stronger in Japan. And the hope is, what I've read is the hope that this will lead to this dismissal of nuclear power, that they will be phased out. And I hope for Japan that they will do that soon.
And this is a big issue. I mean, this is one of the most important issues of the age. It's not even being mentioned in the media because they don't want us thinking about this or knowing about it. They don't want us, the people, involved in any of the decision making. They will make the decisions. We won't even know what's going on. We're thinking about the Vancouver Canucks and the next concert or saving our job or, you know, whatever they've got us focused on.
Or worry about our pensions. Right?
What has actually happened to the people who live around Fukushima? Now, my recollection is there was quite some thousands of people were moved out.
It's in tens of thousands of people.
Okay. And they're not back?
No, they're not back. No, the exclusion zone is definitely a no-go zone. And I believe it's 20-kilometer radius from Fukushima is the exclusion zone, and then up to 50 kilometers you shouldn't really be traveling in that area. So and then what's really sad about it, that Fukushima, that area around those nuclear power plants in Daiichi, is extremely valuable agricultural land. So a lot of things are being grown there normally. A lot of beef cattle, a lot of rice, a lot of vegetables, but of course now they can't really grow that anymore there. And just around that circle, it's just an arbitrary circle that's being drawn up on a map, saying that, oh well, the radiation suddenly stopped here at the 20-kilometer mark, and and after 50 kilometers, it's probably safe again to eat the food. I mean, that's just well, foolishness. right? And that's just to keep the public sort of, engaged, to tell them that it's sort of give them some trust and saying that, we have it under control and you can trust us. But in reality is that, the Japanese citizens that understand the issues, they try to, first of all, leave Japan if they can. And if they can't, move away as far as they can. And if they can't do that, try to eat as little of local produce as possible. But of course, the majority can't just go and leave, right? They got jobs, they got children to feed. Children that go to elementary school and in high school, they wear little dosimeters. Dosimeter is a device. It looks like a little badge you wear. It measures how much radiation you're exposed to make sure that you don't get too much radiation. So children are being exposed to radiation, and the Japanese government has elevated the threshold of what's acceptable, just like how they have elevated the threshold of what's acceptable in food, just arbitrarily. Saying,
they're saying more radiation is now safe?
It's okay, perfectly
and more
all right.
radiation in food is now safe?
Yeah, absolutely.
They've got to.
Yeah, so that way, so that the economy can keep going, because that's really the concern. The concern is that, there's a Nissan automobile manufacturing factory just south of Fukushima, Daiichi. I think it's 45 kilometers or 65 kilometers south of, just outside the exclusion zone. That's where Nissan makes its cars. People buy Nissan products. I mean, if suddenly they were told, imagine what kind of ripple effect this was to be if cars would be turned away or products coming from Japan would be turned away because they were radioactive. I mean, that would cripple and destroy the Japanese economy. And of course, Japan is an intralink into the global economy. So of course, there's a lot of pressure globally not to make this happen. So politicians, the economy, the economic model that we have adopted, we're all interlinked, sort of forces us to go a path that's good for profits, bad for health. And I think that has to change. I think we have to sort of realize that and elect the right people and really occupy.
Yes, we've got to start moving in a completely different direction, because we have nuclear power, because nuclear power powers the manufacturing plants. It powers the plants that allow us to all have cars and everything else. We've got to start giving up all of that, because we're seeing the price that, there's no escape. There's climate change, which is coming at us like a runaway rhinoceros, and it is going to be a disaster of unimaginable proportions. And Fukushima, the nuclear meltdowns at Fukushima are even worse.
Yeah, I think it's a good example of what can happen if you build a nuclear power plant on an earthquake fault, or near a zone that's subject to earthquakes. Well, in California, on the coast, they got multiple nuclear power plants along the California coast. We all know that there's the threat of tsunamis and the threat of earthquakes in San Francisco and down, right? We all have heard of the big earthquake in San Francisco, and then the fire that happened at the turn of the century, right? I think that's all sort of in our imagination, but we assume that technology can save us. We assume that these plants, when they're built in an earthquake-prone zone, that they're going to be safe. I think it's foolishness. Assume that we can guard against what nature can throw at us. I think nature can throw at us big punches, and I don't think we're ready for them.
So remember, there is no safe level of radiation, and what comes out of a nuclear power plant is radiation. You mentioned earlier that in France they did a study, and the closer children lived to a nuclear power plant, the more leukemia there was. What's happened in Japan is that problem times 10,000. I mean, the stuff is out in the open. It's now spread around the world. So we've got to move away from nuclear power. Canada has nuclear power plants. We should be closing them down. Forget about the rest of the world. We should be demanding the closure of all nuclear power plants in Canada.
Yeah.
If that's what Canadians want. I mean, but first we need the information.
Absolutely. I think transparency is key. And I think that's what's so bad about all this. This is just I think I told you this before. I call all these things that are going on in our world a truth emergency. We're living in times where the truth, the accurate information, is not provided to the population. And if people are not given the truth on so many issues, for example, climate change, we're talking that as an example again, the polar ice caps are going to melt. That's been talked about a while ago now. I saw a graph just really recently of Andrew Weaver's Facebook page, where it'll be as early as this year, it'll be summer ice free, or as late as 2020 being summer ice free. Well, somewhere in between there. But it will be ice-free within the next 10 years, basically.
So you're saying
The North Pole will be ice-free during the summertime. Basically, the polar bears are going to go extinct in the next 5 to 10 years. Right. So going back to just the thing I was talking about Iran and how Mr. Harper was sort of worried about Iran and Iran being a threat to the world, basically. Well, what he does, nobody ever talks about, Iran wants a nuclear power plant. A nuclear power plant in itself, if nothing happens, isn't really a threat to anybody. However, though, what they never really talk about, they do, but they don't. The technology to make a nuclear power plant work and run is the same identical technology you need to make a nuclear weapon. And it's twofold, and it comes in two forms. That is, when you have to enrich uranium. That just means you refine uranium to the point where it becomes fuel for a nuclear power plant. If you keep that process going, you can make the fuel more enriched, and you can make a nuclear bomb of a particular type, which is a uranium bomb. But you can also make a plutonium bomb. And for a plutonium bomb, all you need is a nuclear reactor. So it is true that Iran, if Iran runs a nuclear reactor, that it could make plutonium as a side product. Because every nuclear power reactor, on average, produces 250 kilograms of plutonium a year. It only takes 5 kilograms to make a plutonium bomb. The same one that fell, I believe, on Nagasaki was a plutonium bomb. So it is absolutely true that Iran's nuclear power project is indeed a way to get nuclear weapon material. That is true. But that also means that every nuclear reactor that we have, including the Canadian ones, is basically producing a substance called plutonium, which is one of the most deadliest substances that there is, that we've created. It's a man-made material, doesn't normally exist. Has a half-life of 24,000 years, will last, as a rule of thumb, 10 times that long, which means 240,000 years. It takes 240,000 years for plutonium to disappear.
Massively dangerous product.
One millionth of a gram. And I'm just quoting things that I've read from people that are experts in this area. 1 millionth gram of plutonium, if ingested, will give you cancer and you'll die. And this is all scary stuff, and you're like, oh yeah, I've heard this all before. But the issue is that there's so much of this material that has now accumulated over the 40 plus years of nuclear power plant operation that, a pound of plutonium spread equally among every person on Earth will make everybody get cancer and die. So this is toxic stuff. The Finnish government has passed a law where they now build this long-term storage facility that I told you about. And it has to last, for them, it has to last 100,000 years, which the engineers think they can solve that problem. But of course, the problem is not really the engineering problem, but how do you solve the problem with people's, interest and intrigue? What may be buried here? Can I dig this up? Can I use this? Why did people bury this here? 10,000 years from now, they may have long forgotten us and what we have maybe done, and they dig this stuff up and think it's great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Or then decide that this is great stuff, I can make a bomb from this. So, we're doing things that need to be discussed.
So you're saying that with Mr. Harper and Iran, the problem isn't whether or not Iran ever gets a bomb, it's the massive amounts of poison we've created that we have to deal with. Absolutely. Yeah, nobody talks about this long-term storage of this material. And the Americans have tried to deal with this issue, and they still don't have a long-term storage. What they have figured out is what you said earlier in the last segment, that cleverly you can make weapons out of uranium, and not just nuclear bombs is what we sort of all have in our minds of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but you can make bullets, or these armor-piercing rounds, as they call them, penetrator bombs. Made from uranium. Uranium is a really interesting material. It's twice as dense as lead, and it makes a great bunker-busting bomb. They use this terminology during the last Iraq War. And of course, when they use depleted uranium or enriched uranium weapons, which seems to be the case now, there has been new science just done recently where they actually discovered that it was not just depleted uranium that they used in their weaponry in the last Gulf War, but actually enriched uranium, which makes this the most unbelievable war crime of our time, period.
far worse than what, I don't want to really compare one with the other, but what happened during the Third Reich and the Nazis and all that, and with what happened to the Jews, absolutely awful. But what we have done just recently with Iraq and Iraq's future, by bombing them with radioactive material that will destroy their ability to have healthy children basically forever, because uranium has a half-life of 4.5 billion years.
Yeah, this is absolutely beyond belief. It is unimaginable what has been done. And in our name, Canada's over there bombing with the best of them in Afghanistan and in Libya now.
Yeah, there were reports that
our soldiers, our military, our Air Force, our ships are armed with these depleted uranium weapons.
Yeah, there were reports that they did seem to use in Libya just now anti-tank ammunition, depleted uranium type anti-tank ammunition. But of course, the NATO mission, when they were asked about this, the top general of NATO who was, asked about this, what kind of ammunition they were using, they were denying the fact that they were using depleted uranium ammunition. But denying it doesn't necessarily mean it's not true.
No, you can't believe anything they say anymore.
So I think, there's so many issues that really need to be discussed in open dialogue, because really we're talking about our future. We're talking about our children inheriting this world, and what world is it going to be like? It's up to us.
So here we are. We're talking about some of the greatest environmental threats that the planet has certainly faced in a long time. For ourselves,
yeah.
Fukushima and climate change are huge. There's also the genetically engineered food problem, and
absolutely
never discussed. Nobody knows what's happening. In Europe, they're successfully pushing it out. That's my understanding, that in Europe they are trying to defend themselves. But here in Canada, we're number one. Mr. Harper wants nothing more, it seems, than to have as much genetically contaminated food on our tables. Nobody knows the impact. There's been no testing ever to show that it's safe. But again, so we've got to somehow take over the control of what's happening.
Yeah, I think people have to realize that there are things at stake here that are far beyond the little petty issues that our politicians seem to be fighting over. There's Canada pension is important to a lot of people, don't get me wrong, but there are things coming our way that are much bigger than any of these little issues. We're talking about the ability to have a successful country, the ability for people to live a successful or healthy life for generations to come. That's what's at stake here, right? Climate change will affect everybody on Earth. Some are more affected than others, but the fact is that everybody is affected by it in the places where there tend to be drought issues. We see this in Africa now. They have a famine going on there right now. Australia had massive floods last year, and they're just about to have more floods now again. What happens is basically food production is being hampered and affected by a changing or unpredictable climate, right? And of course, the Harper government doesn't seem to want to acknowledge this, that we're going to be affected by this. All they want to do is dig up carbon in form of sand oil or tar sands oil or whatever you want to call it out of northern Alberta and ship it west or south so it can get refined and made into a product and then burnt.
For the benefit of the oil companies.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But they say it's good for jobs, it's good for economy and all that, which is, it may be true if you were to look at the little economic spin-off for that little moment in time. But then if you zoom out and look at the big picture, you see the destruction that goes on. You're actually destroying the ability for people to have jobs in the future. And that economic impact is far, far greater than any of the benefit that we may get from that little bit of oil that we may be selling. The other issue is not the what also in the media gets talked about regarding the pipeline. Oh my God, we're going to destroy the Great Bear Rainforest and all that. And that is true. That is at stake. But what is far greater of an issue, I think, is that we would be allowing that carbon to be moved from one place to another place to be then be burned. That is the threat. The burning of that fossil fuel. The threat is of digging this stuff up in the first place. That is the threat. Now, of course, the oil companies right now that are wringing their hands and go, my God, the North Pole is going to be ice-free soon. We're going to be able to, drill for oil in the Arctic. And that's just great. That's excellent. I mean, I remember the local MP here, Gary Lunn, who was the resource minister at that time, I was talking to him about this issue about, the polar ice melting, because I read an article that basically indicated exactly this, that it's just a few years now away for summer ice to be gone. And he said to me, "Oh, Mr. Simbeck, you don't have to worry. There is so much ice up there. I was just up there on a trip. Oh, it's vast. It's vast. The only good thing that's going to come out of this is that the Northwest Passage is going to become ice-free. And that means we can have shipping and explore some of those resources up there, and that'll be great for our economy." And I looked at him and go, well, that's great that the Northwest Passage becomes ice-free, but what is if it melts further? What is if the actual entire North Pole becomes ice-free during the summertime? Aren't you concerned about this at all? And he didn't really have an answer there. He thought, well, basically, the Harper government has a good plan to basically deal with climate change. That was, to sort of push me out of the way, or basically get me off his back on that issue, thinking that there will be a solution to the problem. It's just some point in the future we'll deal with it.
And once the North Pole is ice-free, of course, instead of you having ice cover it, which reflects the sunlight back into space, suddenly you have dark water which begins to absorb.
Yeah,
the rate of
it's 80% efficient.
Yeah.
As an absorber.
So much more. It just begins to run more out of control.
I guess for the layperson, they look at this, go, well, what the hell can I do? Or, why do I even care about the North Pole being ice covered or ice free? What difference does it make? Well, the way you have to think of it, imagine you have an air conditioning system in your car and you drive somewhere where it's really hot. You're driving through, I don't know, say you go to Texas, or you go down to Phoenix during the summertime. It could be 40 plus degrees outside, and you're really glad that you have an air conditioning system in the car that works to keep it cool, to keep you cool inside and keep your heads cool and keep comfortable. Well, the North Pole is our air conditioning system. We're basically turning off our air conditioning system that keeps the climate under control. You destroy that control mechanism, basically, or you manipulate that control mechanism, things are going to go crazy.
We've got to, I don't know, we've been sleeping for too long. We've lost control of our country. We've got to, unfortunately, put a lot of other things aside, and we've got to take back control of our country. We've got to force democracy on our governments, and we have got to start to begin to try to deal with these problems, which are huge. I mean, how do we start to turn around this mess that we're in? But if we don't, then it seems that nothing but disaster awaits.
It is really overwhelming, and I got a 3-year-old boy at home, and I look at my little boy and I go, well, I look at myself, my own life, and go, what can I do to make a difference? Hence me being on your show and trying to discuss some of these issues, because I look at the big picture and I try to see what's coming my way, what's coming actually my son's way, and what can I do to improve on that. And we still kind of live in this fake reality, as I call it, because there's so much noise on information we're being bombarded with, and the issues that really truly matter are not being discussed. We just pulled out of basically the Kyoto Accord, and the Harper government was really happy about that, not to be obligated to reduce carbon emissions, so that the oil and gas sector and the industries in Canada don't have to basically pay for the emissions. They're polluting our air, right? We are all polluting our air, but it starts with extracting the oil in the first place. So the big polluters, in my opinion, should also pay for the pollution that they cause. I mean, it all makes sense from that regards. If you pollute something, you should pay for it, right? It shouldn't be free. Absolutely not. You should pay for it. But why, there would be so simple things to do to basically turn this around, and I hate to point on the Dion from the Liberal Party, the leadership that was under Dion not so long ago, where he ran with a campaign doing the green shift, changing the taxation system, taxing basically emissions and not your personal revenues. That is a really good way to do it, because that's the carrot and stick approach that we need to basically change around.
And that's why the corporate media completely attacked and destroyed Stéphane Dion, because those kinds of ideas could not be allowed to exist in this country. And Stéphane Dion was attacked from day one and removed. Instead, in his place, we have Stephen Harper as our Prime Minister, the man who the corporations completely control and who is giving them everything that they want. And the corporations are the enemy in all of this, and they own the media. And these are the problems we have got to face up to and start to deal with.
So what people need to do is, basically look at the big picture, ignore the noise, and it's hard to do sometimes, but look at independent media. That's one step to get information that is worthwhile consuming, and then try to deal with the issues on a local level, provincial, and then a federal level.
Promote democracy. I mean, democracy simply means that the people rule. The politicians should not be in a position to tell us what to do. We are supposed to be the ones who rule. We voted to get rid of the HST as another example. We still have it. Why? Because the corporations want it. Because under the HST, they don't pay tax and we do, to the tune of about $2 billion a year. That's the cost. They want the tar sands to be used, and they want all that oil burned so they can make money from it. We've got to stop them. That's the position we now face. Werner, any last word?
Well, I just hope people, this is a very depressing subject matter, I suppose, but I think there is hope. And the Occupy movement that we just saw spring up not so long ago, though it was small in Canada, it was quite substantial in the United States. I think coming this spring and this summer, I think we're going to see that reoccurring, and I hope people will, pay attention and maybe participate in direct democracy.
Ladies and gentlemen, there we are. Thank you very much for watching Face to Face.